Hey, you know how some really big issues just seem to, well, keep circling back?
Uh-huh.
That's kind of what we're looking at today. We're going to take a good look, a really clear look, at the Trump administration's renewed push for a ban on transgender individuals serving in the U.S. military.
Right. And specifically where the Supreme Court fits into all this now.
Exactly. It feels a bit like déjà vu, maybe.
It definitely does. President Trump, now back in office, put out a new executive order. That was back in January.
Okay.
And it's essentially trying to reinstate a ban similar to the one from his first term.
The one President Biden then reversed.
That's the one. So the really big question hanging in the air right now is, will the Supreme Court let this new ban actually take effect while all the legal challenges are still playing out in the lower courts?
Right. It can feel like a real legal tangle. We've been trying to sort through the news reports, piece together the timeline, understand the arguments from both sides.
Yeah.
So maybe let's start there with the timeline again, because this isn't the first time the Supreme Court has weighed in on this, is it?
No, not at all. During Trump's first term, remember, he put that initial ban in place. And back in 2019, the Supreme Court actually allowed it to proceed while the legal fights continued.
Oh, okay. I remember that now.
Then, like you said, President Biden came in and rescinded that policy, and well, here we are again. New executive order from this past January.
Okay, so history repeating, sort of.
Yeah.
What reasons is the administration giving this time? Why bring it back now? What's the official justification?
Well, their stated focus is on maintaining what they call high standards for the military.
Troop standards, okay.
Yeah, they've used specific words like troop readiness, lethality, cohesion, honesty, humility, uniformity, and integrity.
Wow, that's quite a list.
It is. And their core argument seems to be that having transgender individuals serve openly somehow conflicts with these core military standards.
Exactly. I mean, that feels like a pretty broad claim.
Yeah.
Can you break that down a bit? It's not immediately obvious how being transgender connects to, say, lethality or honesty.
Sure. So the executive order itself makes the case that adopting a gender identity different from one's biological sex. It says it conflicts with a soldier's commitment to an honorable, truthful, and disciplined lifestyle, even in one's personal life.
Huh.
Truthful?
Yeah, they even argue that acknowledging a transgender person's gender identity constitutes a falsehood, and that this alleged falsehood is, well, inconsistent with military values like humility and selflessness.
A falsehood? That's strong language.
It is. And they also raise concerns about medical, surgical, and mental health constraints related to individuals with gender dysphoria.
Okay, so that's the executive order. And the Defense Department, they followed up with their own specific policy, right?
Exactly. That came in February. The Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, issued a policy that pretty much mirrors the president's order.
And what does that policy actually do? It generally disqualifies people from service if they currently have or have ever had a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, or if they've undergone medical interventions related to it.
So things like hormone therapy or surgery.
Presumably, yes, though the specifics might be detailed further. And importantly, it set a deadline March 26th.
A deadline for what?
For the military branches to identify transgender service members currently serving and to actually begin the process of separating them from service.
Wow. Separation. Unless
they manage to get a waiver. But the default was separation starting March 26th.
That sounds like it would directly affect quite a few people currently in uniform. Do we have any sense of the numbers? Like, how many service members are we actually talking about here?
We have some estimates. It's not perfectly precise, but the Congressional Research Service, that's the nonpartisan research group for Congress, they reported back in January that around 1,892 active duty members received gender-affirming medical care between, January 2016 and May 2021.
Okay, almost 1,900 receiving care.
Right. Now, the Justice Department says they don't track exact numbers based purely on gender identity. But a defense official did estimate last December that roughly 4,200 troops had been diagnosed with gender dysphoria.
4,200. And how big is the active duty military overall?
Over 1.2 million members. So yes, it's a relatively small percentage.
But still thousands of individuals. That's not insignificant.
Absolutely not. Thousands of careers and lives directly impacted. There was also a Pentagon memo back in February mentioning costs. About $52 million spent on care for gender dysphoria between 2015 and 2024.
$52 million over nearly a decade.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So people's lives affected, careers on the line, and as we said, legal challenges popped up almost immediately. What happened there?
Right. A lawsuit was filed pretty quickly out in Washington state. It was brought by 7 currently serving transgender members, 1 person hoping to enlist, and an advocacy group.
What's their argument? What grounds are they suing on?
Their core argument is that the ban violates the Constitution. Specifically, they point to the guarantee of equal protection under the law.
Equal protection. Makes sense.
And also the First Amendment, arguing it infringes on rights like freedom of speech or expression.
Okay. So constitutional grounds. How did the first court respond? Did the judge agree with them?
Yes, initially. A federal district court judge in Washington state, Judge Benjamin Settle, he sided with the service members back in March.
What did you?
He issued what's called a preliminary injunction. Basically, he hit pause on the executive order.
So he blocked the ban?
He blocked the ban, yeah. And he ordered the administration to stick with the policy that was already in place, the more inclusive one from the Biden era.
And did he give reasons?
He did. And interestingly, Judge Settle has prior military experience himself. He wrote that the Trump administration just hadn't presented any actual evidence to prove their claim.
Claims about readiness and cohesion.
Exactly. No evidence that open transgender service harms readiness, unit cohesion, or lethality. He actually pointed out that the military seemed to operate just fine for 4 years under the previous policy, the so-called Austin policy.
Okay, so a strong ruling from the district court. What did the administration do then? They didn't just accept that, I assume.
Oh, definitely not. The Justice Department immediately appealed that ruling to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals.
The appeals court for the West Coast.
Right. And they asked the Ninth Circuit to put Judge Settle's injunction on hold, basically, let the ban go into effect while the appeal process happened.
And did the Ninth Circuit agree?
No, they didn't. The Ninth Circuit denied that request. They kept the block in place for the moment.
Okay. But wasn't there another case somewhere else?
Yes, good point. There was a similar challenge filed in Washington, D.C., and that one was also initially blocked by a lower court. But the appeals court in D.C. took a slightly different tack and did temporarily halt that specific block.
Ah, so you had different appeals courts reaching kind of different immediate outcomes?
Exactly. A bit of a conflict, which often paves the way for
the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Makes sense. So the administration facing resistance, but also maybe seeing an opening with that D.C. ruling, they took it upstairs.
Precisely. They filed an emergency appeal straight to the Supreme Court.
And what are they asking the Supreme Court to do specifically?
They're asking the justices to intervene right now and allow the ban, the policy issued by Secretary Hegseth, to take effect immediately nationwide while all these legal arguments continue in the lower courts.
Just let the ban happen now, figure out the legality later.
That's the essence of the emergency request, yes. The Solicitor General D. Sauer is making the argument.
And what's his main pitch to the court?
A key part is arguing for substantial deference, basically saying the courts should really defer to the military's judgment on military matters.
Trust the generals?
In effect, yes.
Yeah.
Trust the Defense Department's assessment of what's needed for readiness and national security. Sauer claims that the lower court's injunction, the one Judge Settle issued that applies everywhere, is forcing the military to keep a policy that the Pentagon itself has now deemed harmful to readiness and national interests.
Okay. And how do they counter the argument that this is just discrimination based on transgender status? Because that's what the plaintiffs are arguing, right? Equal protection.
Right. It's a crucial point. Sauer argues the policy isn't actually classifying people based on transgender status or sex assigned at birth.
Oh. How does he frame it then?
He frames it as being based on a medical condition, gender dysphoria, and medical interventions associated with it.
Ah, trying to shift it from an identity category to a medical one.
Exactly. And the legal implication they're hoping for is that if it's seen as a classification based on a medical condition, it might trigger a lower level of judicial scrutiny, meaning the courts would be more likely to uphold the policy.
Less likely to strike it down.
Correct. He also heavily emphasizes the constitutional idea that deciding who makes up the armed forces is primarily a job for the political branches, meaning the president and Congress, not the courts.
Okay, so it's about deference, framing it medically and pointing to the powers of the president and Congress.
Yeah.
What happens next?
The Supreme Court has given the plaintiffs, the service members and groups challenging the ban, until May 1st to file their response to the administration's appeal.
May 1st. So soon.
Very soon. Then the court will likely decide whether to grant the administration's request to let the ban take effect.
Okay, let's just try and summarize this whole thing. It's a lot. The Trump administration wants the ban back, citing military readiness, cohesion, values, things like that. This got challenged immediately in court. arguing it violates equal protection and First Amendment rights.
Yep.
A federal judge in Washington state agreed and blocked the ban, saying there wasn't evidence to support the administration's claims and pointing out the military worked fine under the previous inclusive policy.
Correct.
The Ninth Circuit kept that block in place, but a different appeals court acted differently in a similar case. So now, the administration's asking the Supreme Court to step in now and let the ban proceed while the legal battles continue.
That's pretty much the state of play.
Wow. It's such a complex situation, isn't it? You've got these arguments about military necessity bumping right up against fundamental constitutional rights and, well, equality.
Absolutely. And the core tension really is that balance. How do you weigh the military's assessment of its needs, whether that assessment is accurate or not, against the rights of individuals to serve their country without discrimination?
Especially, as the judge noted, when there were years where they did serve openly, seemingly without the predicted problems. It really makes you think.
It does. It forces you to consider what the actual impact was versus the claimed impact now.
So the Supreme Court's decision here, just on this preliminary step of whether to let the ban take effect, it feels huge.
Yep.
It has immediate consequences for those thousands of service members.
Immense consequences for them.
And it also sends a much broader message, doesn't it?
Huh.
About who belongs in the military, who gets to serve, and maybe what that says about our society's values more generally.
Definitely. It raises really profound questions. What does this whole debate signify, not just for the armed forces, but for how we as a country understand identity, understand equality, and who we deem, well, fit and honorable enough to serve?
Yeah. A lot to think about there. It's definitely a story we'll need to keep following closely.
For sure.
And if you are finding these deep dives useful for making sense of these complicated, important issues, and you want to stay updated on how things like this legal fight unfold, well, please think about subscribing to The Deep Dive.
Wherever you get your podcasts.
Exactly. We'll keep trying to break down these big stories for you, make them understandable, and explore what they really mean. Thanks for tuning in.